but she doesn't really get any credit for it. It would have been largely out of sight, out of mind.
Was sentenced to death.
Those who pass between your legs shall be spared.
Everywhere I go, statues and monuments to history's heroes are easy to find, but none of them really look like me. When I try to find someone relatable, a regular person from an everyday background, quietly pushing against what's expected while trying to live by their values, well, that takes a little bit more effort. Maybe you felt that too, wondering if you and your people are truly represented among the world's celebrated change makers. It almost seems as if changing the world is only for those who do something headline-worthy or fit a particular mould.
Hi, I'm Justine, the nerdy half of the Breakaway Bravehearts, and today I'm in Canterbury,
In London, in the ancient city of Chester,
in Dresden, Leipzig, Liverpool,
Bristol,
the Waitangi grounds in Waitangi, North Island, New Zealand.
and today I'm asking the question, what if making a difference is just about being yourself, especially when you go against the grain? Let's start with the Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women. Their story is just as layered as the cities they helped rebuild after World War II.
The statue shows just one woman, but she represents a whole community. She stands on a pile of bricks, powerful, strong, pickaxe in her hand, scarf on her head. Trümmerfrauen, or rubble women, brick ladies if you will, were instrumental in cleaning up Dresden after the destruction of World War II.
In the aftermath of the devastating Allied bombing in February 1945, Dresden was left in ruins.
With so many men killed, missing, or still prisoners of war, it was up to the women, the widows, the mothers, the teenagers to clear the mountains of rubble that was once their homes, their schools, their shops.
Immediately after taking control, Allied authorities required women between the ages of 15 and 50 to join the clean-up effort. Protective labour laws were lifted, and they worked back-breaking 9-hour days. With no heavy machinery, they used sledgehammers, buckets and bare hands to dismantle unstable buildings, salvaging reusable bricks, steel, wood and even old toilets to be used for rebuilding.
But the story of the Trümmerfrauen is actually a little bit more complex than what the statue may suggest. For many of the women, it wasn't out of altruistic heroism that they went to this work. For many of them, it was the only way to secure food rations, stamps for their families. The physical toll was immense, the pay was meagre, and many of them actually suffered from social stigma. And of course, every day they were literally immersed in the destruction, loss, the trauma that comes with a destroyed city. There are times when their story has been romanticised, politicised, and perhaps their hardships and their lack of options were glossed over. The Trümmer women eventually became symbols of resilience as they rebuilt the city brick by brick, street by street.
Though the story of the Trümmerfrauen is wrapped in complexities, it captures something powerful. As they moved the rubble, they also moved old expectations and shifted ideas about women's roles in society. It's something us ordinary folk have been quietly doing around the world throughout time. From the streets of post-war Germany, let's step into a bustling city pub in England, where one woman quietly shattered a social barrier just by doing her job. Mr. Thomas's Chop House was established in 1867 by husband and wife team Thomas and Sarah Studd, but it wasn't long before Sarah was forced to take control. Her story is being told by Andy, our Invisible Cities guide in Manchester.
Unfortunately, 4 years after opening the place, Thomas became quite ill, which meant that Sarah had to run the place. Now, bearing in mind that these were men only, and the women weren't allowed in the city centre and escorted at the time, one of the first things Sarah did was establish a private ladies' room in here. I believe it was on the first floor. It didn't go down very well, but she was fighting for women's rights well before the suffragettes became known, and she doesn't really get any credit for it. And she said it was a place where a woman could eat, drink and chat in safety, while the husbands were going up to whatever they were doing downstairs. Now 4 years after that, at the age of 45, Thomas died, which meant as well as look after this place, she had to look after 8 kids. So he might have been ill, but he was busy. And at its peak, it could sell 400 meals a day. So you can imagine with the shape of it, it must have been mental. Now, a woman was allowed to take over her husband's business when he died, but she wasn't allowed to take any professional credit for it. So the name remained Mr. Thomas's. But Sarah managed to get women jobs in all the chop houses and subsequently in other areas as well. So again, that was something what nobody else was doing. So she was a real pioneer. But in celebration of International Women's Day in 2019, they changed the name to Mrs. Sarah's Chop House, which again caused a bit of a kerfuffle, with myself included. And then I found out why. You only think, fair cop, sorry Sarah. But 12 months later, they changed the front end back to Mr. Thomas's and the back end to Mrs. Sarah's. Or Mrs. Sarah's rear end, as I like to say, because that's my warped sense of humour. So unfortunately, the sign with Mrs. Sarah's, it's all fallen off, which is a shame, really.
Of course, Sarah wasn't the only pioneer of women's rights to come from Manchester. In the generation that succeeded her, Emmeline Pankhurst was born, who, while criticised at the time for her so-called militant tactics, is now rightfully celebrated as the leader of the British suffragette movement, which won women the right to vote in 1918. Sadly, Sarah didn't live long enough to see this outcome, but she would have seen the street rallies that Emily organised in her Manchester days of the movement, and no doubt heard the conversations in her chop house. And while she may not have commanded armies or written laws, Sarah's presence behind the bar was a small revolution in itself, proof that change can happen, one pint at a time, or even one cup of tea at a time. Let's meet the women who turned their afternoon tea gatherings into a fight for justice. Our host here is Rob Collin, a Blue Badge guide in Bristol, who taught us about the difficult history of England's involvement in the slave economy.
For most ordinary people, they would not have seen the realities of the slave trade in Britain. It would have been largely out of sight, out of mind. Because of that, when the abolition movement started, the leaders of the abolition movement concentrated on informing and educating ordinary people as to the realities of the slave trade. As ordinary people became informed, so many of them were revolted by it. Educated women drinking their tea in the afternoon with slave-produced sugar. British poets, William Cowper, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, concentrated their poetry directed at middle-class women drinking their tea in the afternoon, sweetened and taken and sweetened with slave-produced sugar. So it was about contesting the use of sugar. A Quaker called William Fox, in his publication addressed to the people of Great Britain. It was a publication which was circulated all around Britain in 1791 as part of the abolition movement. But in it, he stated, if we consume the commodity being sugar, yes, you participate in the crime. Absolutely. Really contemporary. This is 1791. That could have been said now. As educated women became informed, it had an effect. And because in 1791, when the first bill to abolish the slave trade failed in Parliament, later that year, the first mass boycott of the purchase of slave-produced sugar. And again, driven by women. And they did it in a very real way, despite having no political power, because they control the purse strings in the home. So women.
Their names didn't make headlines, but their simple acts of defiance, refusing slave-made sugar, became a symbol of hope and solidarity for the anti-slavery cause. It's something I try to remember when I see fast fashion from countries with a poor record for equal wages and child labour laws. When we work together to wield our consumer power, we can be more powerful than we realise. And if everyday choices and quiet rebellion have shaped history, so has sharp intuition and courage in the face of danger. Our next story comes from Aotearoa, New Zealand, where a wahini's brave and clever interpretation of an enemy chief's words saved her people. The story of Te Ao-kapurangi is being shared with us by CC, our knowledgeable and entertaining guide from the treaty grounds at Waitangi.
Come with me because I want to show you my favourite part of this building. It's not the gorgeous architecture, surprisingly, it's this whakairo carving above the door. The woman you see above the door was alive in the early 1800s, and her name was Te Ao-kapurangi. Te Ao-kapurangi came from Rotorua, famous for its sulphuric mud pools and pristine natural landscapes. But she was taken from Rotorua by a Ngāpuhi war party and consequently found herself up here in Ngāpuhi territory. And the group of Ngāpuhi she was affiliated with was led by a either famous or infamous figure, depending which part of the country you're from. His name was Hongi Hika. Now, infamous, of course, because of the musket wars, because see, when Hongi Hika returned to Aotearoa, he brought with him a lot of weapons, specifically the musket. And in 1823, he was going to wage war south again. Hongi Hika knew he would outgun the other warriors, going from may the strongest man win to who had the newest weapons. And Te Ao-kapurangi saw her homeland in Rotorua in the firing line. So she approached Hongi Hika and begged him to spare her people. He told her, "Those who pass between your legs shall be spared." Now, when you see a translation from Māori to English, you'll find a couple of things. There's a lot of figurative and metaphorical language and a lot of emotion behind it. Now, in this case, Hongi Hika was actually talking about her children, those who had come from between her legs. But Te Ao-kapurangi knew, as a rangatira, he couldn't take back anything he said. So she had an idea. And then Te Ao-kapurangi began to voyage back to Rotorua. When she arrived, she called her people towards her, climbed on top of the wharenui, the carved meeting house, and as you see here above the door, she spread her legs and called for the people of her village to pass between her legs. This granted protection of more than 100 people, and Hongi Hika was so mad about that, she and her husband were both banned from ever returning to this part of the country again. But see, she wasn't just twisting his words, because by passing between a woman's legs, you lose any blessing bestowed on you by Tumatoinga, the god of war. That's why Te Ao-kapurangi is at our visitor centre today. Waitangi is a place of peace. Welcome to everyone. You are welcome here.
Te Ao-kapurangi's courage is woven into the stories that endure in Māori history. Her story reminds us that courage isn't just about force. Sometimes it's about wit and presence of mind when it matters most. Characteristics shared by women of 19th century Germany, where one woman in particular used determination and intelligence to light the fire of the women's rights movement.
The Louise Otto-Petters monument here in Rosenthal Park was the first one in the city dedicated to a woman for her intellect and her social contribution, rather than for her wealth. Louise was a pioneer, and she's sometimes called the mother of the German women's movement, which could be why they put her statue here in what was the first ever children's playground for the city. Louise was actually orphaned quite young, and she supported herself through her writing.
She experienced firsthand the limitations imposed on women in education, work and legal rights. She wrote novels, poetries and plays, using her work to support activism while earning herself a living.
As she watched Leipzig grow through the industrial period of the 19th century, she became very concerned about social growth, social justice and women's rights. She argued for equality, economic equality and gender equality. She insisted that progress must include everyone.
In 1849, Louise founded Frauenzeitung, the first political women's newspaper in Germany, which she edited despite government pressures and censorship. And then in 1865, she founded the Allgemeine Deutsche Frauenverein, Germany's first organised women's rights group. Louise's pen was mightier than any sword. She gave a voice to thousands who had been silent for too long. And of course, finding that voice can take up many forms. Let's turn to a character created centuries ago, who, though fictional, embodies boldness and wit that is still inspiring today. Chaucer's wife of Bath. She's loud, she's sharp, and she's unapologetically herself. A reminder that courage isn't only about grand gestures, it's sometimes about simply demanding the right to be you in your way.
The wife of Bath is one of the most vibrant and complex characters in Chaucer's tale, and arguably in all of medieval literature. She's outspoken and full of contradictions, and she upends all the norms of her time. She's a wealthy, confident cloth maker. She's been married 5 times and happily celebrates enjoying sex and having power in a relationship. In her tale, a knight is forced to discover what a woman truly desires. And what does he find out? She wants control over her own life. Go figure. And this is exactly what the wife of Bath does. She gains self-determination through her body, her voice, her experience. Amazing how this medieval character matches our modern philosophy, and a 1960s philosopher, Audre Lorde, perhaps said it best. She said, "If I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crushed into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive." Pretty powerful stuff. So I'm kind of loving the wife of Bath. She refuses to be eaten alive by the societal expectations of her time, by religious beliefs around how she should treat herself and her body.
The wife of Bath ignored stereotypes, but sometimes fighting those stubborn stereotypes can have life or death consequences. Which brings us to Florence Maybrick, whose story is tangled in suspicion, scandal, and the powerful impact of public opinion. Like the wife, Florence found herself judged by the world's expectations of a woman, and her fight, though very different, shows just how dangerous those stereotypes can be. Florence's story was shared with me by a volunteer guide at Liverpool's St George's Hall.
She was the very first American woman to be tried in a British court for murder, accused of killing her husband by feeding him arsenic. She was on a cruise ship going from New York to Liverpool. She was 17. A man called James Maybrick was 42. He was also on the same ship. By the end of the 7-day voyage, they were engaged to be married.
Their whirlwind romance soon produced 2 children, but it wasn't long before James was dead.
Florence was accused of killing him by feeding him arsenic.
Florence claimed she had been treating herself with the arsenic under doctor's orders.
It was said that she bought fly papers, but she did that because she had an eruption of her skin, and she'd been given a prescription by a New York chemist. She's lost it, but she remembered what the ingredients were, and one was arsenic, and fly papers in those days had arsenic in them.
Her trial quickly became a public spectacle. Florence wasn't allowed to speak in her own defence. Her husband was known to self-medicate with arsenic, but the judge barely mentioned that to the jury. Instead, her character was picked apart.
She stood here, was sentenced to death.
But 2 decades later, Florence had become a symbol of how the justice system failed women.
6 months after the court case, her mother was sent back a Bible, and what was in the Bible? The prescription from the New York chemist.
Her case raised serious questions about how women were treated in the courtroom and about the influence of public opinion over justice.
I wish someone would make a film of it, but it's also said her husband, James Maybrick, is also possibly Jack the Ripper.
Oh my gosh. Florence Maybrick's story reminds us how public scrutiny and societal judgment can shape a person's fate, sometimes trapping them in roles they never chose. But not every response to that pressure is loud or dramatic. Some people can find their own way, choosing silence, reflection, or a single-minded purpose. We're talking about the life of the Anchoress of St John's Church, whose decision to step outside the noisy world and embrace solitude was itself a powerful act of independence.
An anchoress is a woman who has voluntarily given up all her worldly goods to seal herself away in a cell and devote herself entirely to God. An anchoress would seal herself away in a cell on the side of a church or a city wall, with only one window for the public to pass by and one narrow slot in the doorway where food was passed through. She was not allowed to be touched, and she could never leave her room. In fact, the ceremony for going into the room was rather like a funeral, because you were giving up your life for that of others. Your role was to entirely dedicate yourself to thoughts of God and the teachings of the Bible, and share those through your little window with the public as they passed by. Actually, there's a little bit of discrepancy or debate as to where her cell was exactly located. Locals tell me it's on the church grounds. Google tells me it's somewhere in the park. And AI tells me something completely different. So I haven't been able to find the actual spot, but I know a lot about what her life would have been because I've read a modern version of the documents of the actual Anchoress of Norwich, Julian of Norwich. She wrote down her life while she was living in this cell, and she risked breaking rules by passing it through the bars to one of the passers-by in the street so that it could be seen by later generations. I highly recommend this book if you're interested in this. Huge insight into life at the time. Julian became an anchoress when she first started seeing visions during an illness, and she believed that she had spoken with Jesus. And that belief was so strong that it impacted on all the rest of her life to the point where she needed to lock herself away and dedicate herself to those voices that she still heard. And while it seems like it would have been a solitary life, actually it was full of social activity because daily passers-by would come past the window seeking advice, passing on gossip, or simply just wanting to be in the presence of the anchoress. Julian's account of her life as an anchoress is absolutely incredible to read, and it's one of the main sources that we understand medieval life, especially for women. She talks about how in the first few years she really had to adjust to being alone in the cell and the regrets that she went through in her life. She was still very much internal and thinking about herself and her life, and then gradually she let that slip away and became focused entirely on her faith. She would have heard those bells chime, and they would have meant something very special to her.
Her life may seem restricted from the outside, but it's a good reminder that sometimes claiming your own story means making space for your own voice. The Anchoress of Chester made a decision that set her apart. She stepped outside the usual script and into a tiny room, dedicating her life to contemplation and spiritual advice in the support of her community. Her choice was respected and honoured, yet it meant carving out a life that looked nothing like her neighbours. Sadly, for some of us, finding that resilience is more than we can cope with. And we're going to end with a sad and ghostly story. A haunting tale of how sometimes the weight of social rules and the longing for agency and connection can lead to tragic ends.
Here, beneath the shade of the trees and beside the still waters, the spirit of a woman lingers. They say a woman in white walks along the lake's edge, a ghostly figure. She doesn't scream or wail, she's just sad. The story goes she was a noble woman, young, well connected, and she fell in love, but with the wrong man, a commoner. When the affair was discovered, she was ruined. In Georgian and Victorian times, a woman's reputation was everything. Just a hint of impropriety could ruin all her future marriage prospects, put her in exile from polite society, and plummet her family status.
And this wasn't just gossip. A damaged reputation could mean being disowned, unable to marry, or even institutionalized. Sadly, it's estimated that thousands of women were placed in asylums during the 19th century under vague charges like hysteria or moral insanity, mostly just behaviour that simply didn't conform.
There was no redemption. This was social death. So she walked into this lake, and many say she's still there. Not angry, just lost, trapped by societal rules that made her feel like this lake was her only source of peace.
If I bumped into the ghost today, I'd be honest with her. It's true. The world still doesn't overflow with compassion, but things really have changed for the better. Now she'd find more support, people ready to stand by her, and a lot more acceptance than she ever had in her own time. She wouldn't be alone, because from shattered cities to quiet corners and humble bars,
Sorry, Sarah.
world-changing courage comes in many forms all around the world. And sometimes it can look just like me and you.
Happy travels, everyone.